This next video, we're going to sort of make a link, if you like, between the product prices and the prices of the cloth and the food. Link that through into the price of the factors of production, and that's basically all we're doing in this hopefully relatively short video, and show how that maps out. And at the end of it, we actually get quite an important result in terms of this that we're then going to use again later on in subsequent videos, in terms of an important trade result that we get when we actually introduce international trade. Okay, so remember, we're now allowing factors of production to move between sectors, and so now we want to look at how firms decide on what mix of inputs to use, how much labour, how much capital. Yeah. So, of course, the answer to that is in the relative prices of the factors, the relative prices of labour and capital, and that will dictate the proportions, almost, if you like, that the firms will use in these. So the way we express this, we are, again, in the same way that we talk about relative prices of the goods. We're talking here about the relative factor prices, the W here, that's just the wage rate, so that's the labour, the price of labour, and our rental rate of capital, the price of capital. And so we're going to use that. It's relative, those relative prices of the factors of production. We're going to use that in this video. Now, the first thing we want to do is sort of just a first step here. We can graph the relationship between factor prices and that mix of labour and capital that is used in the production of food and the production of cloth. So again, just looking at this at the diagram here, just note what we've got on the axes. We've got the relative factor prices here on the vertical axis, and this is the relative labour to capital ratio. Yeah, it's important to remember it's not the absolute amount of labour and the absolute amount of capital. It's the relative use. It's the ratio of those. Okay, so it's going to be downward sloping. I've got here the cloth, the curve for cloth. It's downward sloping, of course, because when wages are relatively low, in other words, the W is low relative to the rental rate of capital, then of course firms are going to choose to use more labour, so the L will be higher and the K will be lower. Yeah, and so that gives it its downward sloping shape. Now I'm just going to pick this point here. So this relative factor prices, that's the labour to capital ratio that's going to be used for cloth. Now I've also got here the food, and you can see that the food curve is to the left of the cloth curve. And the reason for that, of course, you can see that for this given relative factor price ratio, the food is going to use relatively less capital. Remember, I'm going to use the same example as I used in the previous video, that remember the production of food was capital intensive, and therefore by definition the production of cloth was labour intensive. So of course for any given wage, any given relative wage rate, that labour to capital ratio for cloth is going to be higher. Yeah? Cloth just simply uses more labour at each and every relative factor price ratio. Yeah, so that makes sense. That's relatively easy. Again, we're not necessarily saying that more cloth is produced. This is not a production thing here. In terms of is more cloth is produced than food. This is in relative terms, and all we're saying is cloth is used labour is used relatively more in cloth than in food. Another assumption that we're going to use here is that it's a competitive market. That just makes it easy in the sense that we know that in a competitive market, price is equal to marginal cost. So in other words, the price of the good depends on the cost of the good, and it's and they're one and the same. Yeah. So the usefulness of that is, so if, for example, wages rise, then of course the price of the good using a lot of labour, that's labour intensive, is going to rise proportionally more than for a good that uses little labour. Because if you're only using a little bit of labour, an increase in the wages, in terms of the overall cost of the good, it's not going to increase the cost all that much, and so therefore it won't have much effect on the price, because the increase in the cost is relatively small. Yeah, so that's again, that's something that we're going to use a little bit later in terms of the intensity of the factors and the effect that has. So in other words, there's going to be a positive relationship between the ratio of the factor prices and the ratio of the goods prices. Again, remember that therefore, and we'll show this in a sec, that that if the price of cloth, remember, which was labour intensive, is higher, and therefore that is higher, the wage in relative terms, and so we can plot that out. A pretty simple graph, but a diagram. I'm going to use a version of this in a minute. So again, on the vertical axis, we've got the relative price of cloth. So now we're sort of starting to make that link between the goods prices, the product prices, and the factor prices. So we've got the relative wages on the horizontal axis, and the relative prices of the goods themselves on the vertical axis. And you can see I've got this sort of supply curve, if you like. Given that cloth is relatively more labour intensive, remember, so you get an increase in the price of labour, that whether W is going up and or R is going down, it doesn't really matter, but let's just say wages are going up. So we're moving in this direction here as that wage rental ratio gets higher. That's going to, of course, increase the relative price of cloth, because labour is an important component in the production of cloth. Therefore, it's an important component in the cost of cloth, and therefore it's going to increase the price of cloth as well. So we get a positive relationship here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I should just flip back here for a second. We're going to bring these two together. Now what I'm actually going to do on this next slide is, it's hard for me to show. I'm going to mess this up, but basically I'm going to flip this this diagram sort of in an anti-clockwise direction, and then combine it with what we just did before. So you can see here, there's the price. So if you tilt your head to the side, that was the vertical axis in the previous one, that was the horizontal axis. So I've just sort of rotated that, and there's that positively here, in terms of that, it's the positively sloped curve there. And then now I've got the relative factor prices on the vertical axis, and that labour capital ratio, which was the one from the previous diagram. So I'm linking the two together to look at the input mix. Okay, so we're starting off, let's assume we start off a point here. Whoops, that's a really good line. With a relative factor prices of that. Given that we've got a price there, and a relative price of cloth in terms of food of that, and the use of, that's the labour capital ratio for food, and that's the initial labour to capital ratio for cloth. Remember, cloth is more labour intensive, so that labour capital ratio is going to be greater than it is for food. Then what I want to do, ultimately, when the relative prices increase, both the production of food and cloth is going to use less, or the ratio of labour to capital is going to decrease. Yeah, and we can show that very simply here. You see, so in other words, if we're moving along this curve here in this direction, say to this point such as that one there, with a higher price, higher relative price, you can see that in terms of cloth, we're going to move back up, if you like, in this direction. Oh, that's a terrible curve. That's a terrible arrow. Sorry. We're going to move back up in that direction in terms of the cloth, and so the labour to capital ratio is going to fall. All right. Relatively less labour or capital, and the same for food. Obviously, they're starting from a different point. That also is going to fall. Now, again, going back to not the previous video, but the previous topic, when we were talking about the marginal productivities. Now, and remember we said that if labour falls, we've got diminishing marginal utility. So if labour rises, the marginal product of labour falls. But conversely, of course, then if labour falls, then the marginal product is going to rise. And you can remember that in both of these situations, the labour to capital ratio is falling. Furthermore to that, given that we also established in a previous topic that the wage was equal to the marginal product of labour, that's what they were going to get paid, then that means by definition that this, again using a horrible arrow, that's going to rise, and so in other words down this we're going to, the relative wages is going to increase. By the same token, of course, if the NPL is rising, the marginal product capital is going to be falling, so we're sort of getting, that's just reinforcing what we've just done there. This is going to reinforce that high relative factor price ratio. So this actually leads to an important result. This is what we're going to use again subsequently. If the price of the labour-intensive good rises, then the real wage of the workers is going to rise. The real rental rate of capital will fall. So there's been a distribution of income, a change in the distribution of income, I should say. Yeah, towards, in this case anyway, towards labour and away from capital. So changes in prices affect income distribution, and this ultimately leads to this what we call the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. So if the relative price of good increases, the real return of the factor used intensively in that good increases, while the real return to the other factor decreases. So this is the start of us looking at this again, this idea of changing the income distribution, changing the winners and losers, if you like, that can occur. So this point here, or these points here, are really important to remember. We're obviously going to use that when we start to talk about international trade.